Hello and greetings. So, we're going to be looking at the seventh day Sabbath from a biblical perspective. I really invite you to please look into all these things and prove all things to make sure they're true. I could be in error. So, number one, we're going to do the following. Whenever you see the word Lord in all caps, that is where the name Yahweh or YHWH should be. For Elohim, that's where they typically translated that word as God, but that has a couple problems with that. And the name Yahshua, some will say Yeshua, where you get the name Jesus. I'm going to use the form that I believe is closest as Yahshua. And for Messiah, HaMashiach, it's probably spelled incorrectly, but that's just for pronunciation, is where you get the word Christ. So let's take a look at what the scriptures are going to teach us. It says, "And on the seventh day Elohim ended his work which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. Then Elohim blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which Elohim had created and made." Note that the Sabbath existed before Moses and the nation of Israel. So for those who claim the Sabbath was only for Israel, again, this was created before Moses. In addition to that, if Adam and Eve, let's say, never sinned, they still would have kept the Sabbath. Hebrews 4:9 says, "So there is still a Sabbath rest for the people of Elohim." Now, some Bible translations just simply say there is still a rest for the people of Elohim. So, but if you look up the Greek word rest, it comes from the Greek word sabbatismos, derived from the word Shabbaton, and it literally means a Sabbath rest or Sabbath keeping. You could look up the word rest in Greek, sabbatismos, referring to a seventh day Sabbath keeping. Why even mention the seventh day Sabbath in Hebrews many years after the death and resurrection of Messiah if the Sabbath is not needed? Doesn't make sense unless the Sabbath is still in effect. Matthew 12:8 says, "For the Son of Man is master of the Sabbath." The common Bible translations will say he's the quote unquote Lord of the Sabbath. But if he's the master of the Sabbath and the Sabbath is done away, is he now the master of nothing? If you claim Yahshua broke the Sabbath and did away with it, this doesn't make any sense, even for those who think the law has been done away with. This is because while Messiah was still living, he had not yet died and supposedly did away with all those Old Testament laws. So let's look at the context of those who claim he broke the Sabbath. Matthew 12:1, it says, "At that time Yahshua went on the Sabbath day through the corn, and his disciples were hungered and began to pluck the ears of corn and to eat. But when the Pharisees saw it, behold, thy disciples do that which is not lawful to do upon the Sabbath day." This is what they said to the Messiah. Your disciples are breaking the Sabbath. But again, this was a tradition of the Pharisees. This was not a biblical thing. So in their mind, he was breaking the Sabbath. He was breaking the traditions that they created about the Sabbath, but not the Sabbath itself. Even if you believe after he died he did away with Sabbath, while he was yet living, he would have had to keep the Sabbath. So this makes no sense because you're in essence saying he was breaking a commandment. But again, for those who believe they only changed after he died, this doesn't make sense because this is while he was yet living. Let's read on. "Then the Pharisees and scribes asked him, Why not walk thy disciples according to the tradition of the elders, but eat bread with unwashed hands? He answered and said unto them, Well did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. Howbeit in vain do they worship me, teaching for the doctrines the commandments of men. For laying aside the commandment of Elohim, you hold the tradition of men, as the washing of pots and cups, and many other such things you do." So the Messiah reprimands them for honoring the tradition of the elders, but the worship is vain because these are just humanistic traditions. And this is just like with the Sabbath. They created traditions about the Sabbath, about what was work, what wasn't, that had no biblical justification, and they made these things equal to, if not greater than, biblical law. So when the Messiah broke this tradition of the elders, in their mind, he was breaking the Sabbath itself, but he was not breaking the actual Sabbath. He broke the traditions that the elders created regarding the Sabbath, not the Sabbath itself. Isaiah 66:23 is believed by many to be a future prophecy, and it says, "And it shall come to pass from one new moon to another, and from one Sabbath to another shall all flesh come worship before me, says Yahweh." If this is indeed prophetic in nature, and this is a future time where people are going to come together on the Sabbath to worship, is think about it in this context. The Sabbath was created back in Genesis. So in Genesis, before Moses, the Sabbath existed. During the time of Moses, the people kept the Sabbath. Of the time of the Messiah, they kept the Sabbath. But now the Sabbath has been done away with. But then in the future, people will be keeping the Sabbath again. So there's this on, off period, and then supposedly on again for the Sabbath. Logically speaking, does that make any sense? Let's go on. Acts 15:19 through 22 says, "Wherefore my sentence is that we trouble them not, from which among the Gentiles are turned to Elohim, but that we write unto them that they abstain from pollutions of idols and from fornication and from things strangled and from blood." Many people believe that the only things that the Gentiles needed to do were these things, and that things like the Sabbath and the biblical feast, well, these were simply not needed, as long as they stayed away from fornication, things strangled by blood, and the pollution of idols. But this doesn't make any sense because there's other commands that we would believe in today's age, such as being charitable, showing hospitality, that would be commandments that we would keep, yet these aren't mentioned. And what many people fail to miss is if you read literally verse 21, it says, "For Moses of old time hath in every city them that preach him, being read in the synagogues every Sabbath." Why is Moses, the synagogues, and the Sabbath even being mentioned? This is because, in context, what was happening was the Gentiles were turning to the true Creator, they were learning things. So, in essence, they were given the main things to start with. The big issues. Modern day churches do this too. If a person comes to your congregation and let's say has a liquor and gambling problem, you're going to work on those things first. You're not going to hit him with, learning biblical Hebrew or biblical Greek, and you're not going to do these things. You're going to hit him or her with the big sins. Things with idols, fornication, things with blood were very common in the Greek and Roman pagan cultures of that day, and these were commonplace. So they started with these things. The context of Moses being preached in the synagogues every Sabbath is, in essence, the Gentiles will learn the other things of the scriptures when they come to the synagogues on Sabbath and they hear the words and the teachings of Moses. Again, if people believe Moses' words are irrelevant in the Testament, why is he even being mentioned in this context in the book of Acts? It doesn't make sense unless Moses' words are still true, still valid, and the Sabbath still exists, and that the Gentiles who come to the synagogue on the Sabbath will learn all the additional things of scriptures, but they need to start with the big things of idols, fornication, and things with blood. Let's move on. In Acts 17:2 through 4, it says, "And Paul, as his manner was, went into them, and 3 Sabbath days reasoned with them out of the scriptures, opening and alleging that the Messiah must have suffered and risen again from the dead, and that this Yahshua whom Paul preached unto them is Messiah. And some of them believed and consorted with Paul and Silas, and of the devout Greeks a great multitude, and of the chief women not a few." Again, let's look at the context of what's being said here. Moses was just preached every Sabbath, right? We just read that. But now Paul is reasoning with these people on the Sabbath days, the Sabbath, talking about how the Messiah had to suffer and rise again. So here's the context of this. This is Acts. Many will say, oh, he was only doing that for the Jews because he knew the Jews were there, so he could preach to them. But this doesn't make any sense because it literally says, "And of the devout Greeks a great multitude." The Greeks were not Jews, they were Gentiles. They are Gentiles. But yet here they were listening to Paul as he reasoned with them on the Sabbath days. Gentiles, Greeks, devout, listening to Paul preach on the Sabbath days. Doesn't make any sense if there is no Sabbath. Let's continue on. "So he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up to read." This is the Messiah himself. Okay? His custom was to go to the synagogue on the Sabbath day. Paul once said, imitate me as I imitate Messiah in 1 Corinthians 11. So would Paul be doing what he did and observe the Sabbath, just like the Messiah did? And if yet people want to claim they want to mimic Paul, then they themselves would also be keeping the Sabbath because Paul did that. And are we supposed to be doing what Paul did, walking as the Savior walked? He who says he abides in him himself ought to walk just as he walked. Okay? A little later in the chapter, after Paul shares Yeshua with the Gentiles, we see the Gentiles were quite interested. In Acts 13:42, so when the Jews went out of the synagogue, the Gentiles begged that these words might be preached to them the next Sabbath. Boom, here we go. When the Jews went out of the synagogue, the Gentiles begged that these words might be preached to them the next Sabbath. Gentiles were asking to be preached the scriptures on the next Sabbath. Here's the perfect situation for Paul to tell the Gentiles, come back tomorrow. We now believe in the Sunday resurrection. That Sabbath is old Jewish stuff. We don't do it. But no, the Gentiles are begging to be preached to on the Sabbath. Acts 18:1. After these things, Paul departed from Athens and went to Corinth. And he found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome. And he came to them. So because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for by occupation they were tent makers. And he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded both Jews and Greeks. Again, Jews and Greeks on the Sabbath. What is going on here? Sabbath is supposedly done away. Why are Jews and why are Greeks keeping the Sabbath? And why is Paul not telling them they've got it all wrong? These things are done away. We're under a new era. No more Sabbath. You don't see any of this in any of this context in any way, shape, or form. Let's go back. The text of Constantine's Sunday Law of 321 AD. On the venerable day of the sun, let the magistrates and people residing in cities rest, and let all workshops be closed. In the country, however, persons engaged in agriculture may freely and lawfully continue in their pursuits, because it often happens that another day is not suitable for grain sowing or vine planting, lest by neglecting the proper moment for such operations, the bounty of heaven should be lost. The ancient Christians were careful in their observation of Saturday, or the seventh day. It is plain that all the Oriental churches and the greater part of the world observed the Sabbath as a festival. Like Athenius likewise tells us that they held religious assemblies on the Sabbath, not because they were infected with Judaism, but to worship Yahshua, the master of the Sabbath. Venus says the same. Antiquities of the Christian Church, Volume 2. You can go ahead and look this up here. So let's look at some of the common verses people will use to say the Sabbath is not done away. They'll say that the Sabbath is done away. Romans 14:5. One person considers one day more sacred than another. Another considers every day alike. Each of them should be fully convicted in their own mind. He that regardeth the day regardeth it unto the master, and he that regardeth not the day to the master, he doth not regard it. He that eateth, eateth to the master, for he giveth Elohim thanks. And he that eateth not to the master, he eateth not, and giveth Elohim thanks. Romans 14:5 has nothing to do with the seventh-day Sabbath. The context of this is talking about eating, fasting. One person considers one day more sacred than another in context of refraining from food, because there is no biblical command that says something like, thou shalt not eat every Thursday and Friday thou shalt fast. It's up to the person to decide what day they want to fast, because there is not a biblical command that specifically states, thou shalt not eat on this Thursday or thou shalt not eat on this Friday. This doesn't make any sense with the context of the Sabbath, as we just read all the previous verses about Paul keeping the Sabbath, as was his custom, as was the custom of the Messiah. The Sabbath being created back in Genesis. Hebrews 4:9 talking about how there remains a Sabbath rest. And in Acts about how the Jews and the Greeks were being preached to on the Sabbath. And it was the Greeks who wanted Paul to come back on the following Sabbath. You can't say that you be convicted and do whatever day you want, but yet Paul is keeping the Sabbath. The Messiah kept the Sabbath. The Greeks kept the Sabbath. Romans 14:21 says, it's good to neither eat meat nor drink wine nor do anything which your brother stumbles or is offended or is made weak. So again, in this context of Romans 14:5, we are talking about refraining from food, regarding one day more sacred than another in regards to not eating food or fasting. Another common verse that people like to use is Colossians 2:16 through 17. It says, therefore, do not let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink with regard to a religious festival, a new moon celebration, or a Sabbath day, which are a shadow of things coming, but the body is of Messiah. Now, there's many who will believe that Paul is saying, don't let people judge you when you don't keep the Sabbath or these new moons, because these things have been done away, and now the Messiah is here. That's the reality. But again, think about this in this context. How could he say, don't let anyone judge you in regards to the festival, a new moon celebration, or a Sabbath day, when we just read all the examples of him keeping the Sabbath with Jews and Greeks, right? And so Messiah is the reality of these things, but that does not take away our obligation to do them. For example, Israel of old was told to put the blood of the lamb on their doorposts so that they would be passed over when they were in Egypt, right? They physically had to still honor that command. So you do the physical to honor the spiritual, right? They couldn't spiritually put blood on their doors. They had to physically kill the lamb, put the blood, so that they could be physically and also spiritually passed over. And so in this context, Paul is actually telling believers, don't let the outsiders judge you in regards to the Sabbath or the feast. These are the outsiders, the people saying you don't need to do these things. These are the people he's warning. Don't let them judge you, because they're not actually doing these things. They have no right to make a judgment on these things. This is the context that makes more sense. Think of it this way. In 1 Corinthians 5:7 through 9, it says, get rid of the old yeast so that you may be a new unleavened batch, as you really are. For Messiah, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Therefore, let us keep the festival, not with the old bread, leavened with malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. Paul here is talking about keeping the festival of the unleavened bread and the Passover, right? How could he be saying, don't let people judge you because those Old Testament celebrations are all done away with, when he himself is saying, let us keep the festival? Literally here, let us keep the festival. And this is in Corinth. This is who he's writing to, the Corinthians. These are Gentiles. So again, it doesn't make any sense to say that these things are done away with, but yet he's saying, let's do it. So again, in this context, we really have to look at it. So I'll end it with this. This could be another study because it's kind of deep, but there's many people who believe that the Messiah rose on a Sunday morning, but this is proven false in many different ways. I even decided to do some search online. It says here, the phrase Yahshua 3 days and 3 nights refers to Yahshua's burial and resurrection, which is said to fulfill the sign of Jonah, prophecy in Matthew 12:40. However, the traditional understanding of a Good Friday crucifixion and Easter Sunday resurrection does not account for 3 full days, leading to alternative interpretations. This includes a Wednesday burial and Saturday resurrection, which accounts for 3 full days and nights from a Jewish perspective of a day starting at sunset. Think of it in this context. If you believe he died on a Friday night and rose Sunday morning, it's impossible to get 3 full days and 3 nights out of that. Now, some people say, well, that doesn't really matter, but it does, because he said that no sign would be given to them except the sign of Jonah. Jonah was in the belly of the fish or the belly of the whale for 3 full days and 3 full nights, just as the Messiah had to be dead for 3 full days and 3 full nights, and then he rose. And then if you read the rest of the passages, it talks about how the women went out to see him the next day, but he was already risen. But again, that's a deeper study. But this is the context that the Sabbath still exists. It was created back in Genesis. The Messiah kept it. Paul kept it. The early Gentile converts kept the Sabbath. And there's nothing in the Bible to indicate that the seventh-day Sabbath has been replaced with a Sunday. The tradition of Sunday goes all the way back to the Roman Catholic Church, with influence of Constantine, who was a known sun worshiper, not a worshiper of the son. Anyhow, let me know what you think, and please do your homework. I could be very wrong in everything I'm saying. You need to do your homework and not follow the traditions of men, because the traditions of men will lead you to death. The scriptures tells us there is a way that seems right to man, but in the end it is the ways of death. So our job as believers is to find the truth, seek it out, and do our best to apply it to our lives, because this is what life is about: seeking the truth and applying it, and remembering that it's not our righteousness that saves us. The blood atonement of Messiah is what saves us. However, that does not negate obedience. I hope to see you soon. May Yahweh, the eternal creator, continue to bless you through the blood of his beloved son Yahshua, the soon coming King. Thank you.